late and after the break. We appreciate your participation. On behalf of SEA, I'd like to welcome Professor David Lelyveld, who has kindly agreed to deliver this lecture. The title for today's lecture is Formulations of Caste and Race by and about Muslims in India. David Lelyveld is a professor of history, retired from William Patterson University in the United States. He's the author of Aligarh's First Generation, Muslim Solidarity in British India, and co-editor of A Wilderness of Possibilities, Urdu Studies in Transnational Perspective. His most recent publications deal with the social and political history of Urdu and its differentiation from Hindi. His current project is Sir Syed and Macaulay's Curse, a 3-generation study of an Indian Muslim family. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago and has held faculty and administrative positions at the University of Minnesota, Columbia, and Cornell. It is my pleasure to welcome to El Colegio de México, Dr. David Lelyveld.
Buenas tardes. It's really a remarkable thing after our long COVID isolation to be speaking to real live human beings, even if you have masks in front of you. And it's a great pleasure to be here at the Colegio de México. I wasn't expecting such a magnificent building and institution. And to have my friend Saurabh Dubey here, who I expect to criticize me when Banerjee Dubey gets here, more criticism. So we are used to long dialogues and discussions, and that I hope will be part of our discussion. Mask or no mask, microphone or no microphone, we'll have to deal with that. So I want to talk about the concept of caste and the concept of race, and back in the background, and maybe I hope not too far, the concept of class and how those terms have been used in India, but maybe beyond that, and whether they caste as defined by various historians and social scientists is something particular to India, or is something that can be applied to other societies, whether in fact there is such a thing as caste. I want to raise that as a question, or as a caste system as such, and to compare it to the concept of race. In recent years, there has been a considerable development of the idea of the great leader of what was then called the Scheduled Caste movement, the Dalit movement, arguing that caste is inherent in the Hindu religion, that caste and Hindu are bound up together. Whether that's true or not is something we can discuss, but my interest is also to what extent it goes beyond Hindu people who define themselves or are defined by others as Hindu to the very considerable population of Muslims in India and beyond that in South Asia, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, and maybe Sri Lanka as well. Can we apply the concept in any useful way to Muslims, Christians, Jews, Parsis, others, but I will be concerned here with Muslims. The other thing is whether it can be applied to other societies. Last year, whenever that was, during the COVID, we have a vague sense of time. Last year, there was a very popular best-selling book for many, many months on the top of the New York Times bestseller list by Isabel Wilkerson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from the New York Times. called simply Caste. And that, has anyone here read that book or seen it? Yes? And has it been translated into Spanish? I bet it has. But in any case, her argument was that in order to understand the condition of Black Americans, of African Americans, and the long history of oppression in the United States particularly, one would do well to look to India and to the concept of caste. That wasn't an original idea of hers. It goes back into the 1930s and 40s, and distinguished social scientists argued this out. When I, at that time, Gunnar Myrdal notably, and a number of others, the great African-American sociologist Oliver Cox wrote a Marxist critique of the notion that caste was a useful concept to apply to African Americans. In her book, by Isabel Wilkerson's book, she very deliberately puts the condition of African Americans alongside the condition of Dalit, that is the so-called untouchables or scheduled castes of India, and speaks to their common situation. This again is not original with her. The movement for Dalit mobilization and liberation, one major part of it was the Dalit Panthers, pulled out of the Black Panthers movement of the United States in the late 1960s. And as she points out, Martin Luther King came to India and identified himself with the Dalits. And there is a long history of back and forth acknowledgement of some sense of commonality. Maybe one can say it's the commonality of the oppressed of the world, les damnés de la terre of Fanon's book. And whether we are talking about, is it helpful to use the concept of caste to explain all the forms of inequality and oppression that exist in the world? When I was in graduate school long ago, as Tavinder Khan mentioned, at the University of Chicago, there were grand debates about caste. And actually, my friend Ajahn Appadurai has written and spoken a bit about that in connection with Isabel Wilkerson's book. And we were talking about whether there was an essential concept of caste which defines the Indian civilization. And the major spokesman for that concept was a French anthropologist, Louis Dumont, who was very influential at that time, and then, frankly, has sort of disappeared from the discussion, including in Isabel Wilkerson's book. One part of what he talks about is to what extent this can extend beyond Hinduism, however one wants to define Hinduism. And he basically says no, that things that look alike aren't alike if they are not rooted in a similar ideology, and that ideology, his whole book, which is called Homo Hierarchicus, published, I think, maybe perhaps 1969, was one may say the last call of Orientalism, the notion that you could define a whole civilization with essential ideas that applied to everything. And Dumont argued that India was unique in the caste system and that it did not apply to other societies. And actually, he pays attention to the argument that he anticipates the argument of Isabel Wilkerson and such, though as I say, she doesn't mention him, by debunking the notion that the understanding of caste in India would tell us something about the condition of black people in the United States. Now, I'm not going to attempt here to recapitulate Dumont's argument, but I will say basically the argument is that India, this caste system, civilization of India, is based on a notion that the society exists as a whole organism. We use the term holism to describe it, and that what holds that society together is, on the one hand, a hierarchy in which the higher levels encompass the other, and there is a division of authority, and a division between authority and power. That is, ideological authority exists in Dumont's understanding with the category Brahmin, a very problematic category in itself, although perhaps easier than many of the others, and the category of ruler in whatever form one that it could take. That the Brahmin is not the ruler. The Brahmin is the source of authority, and the ruler is the source of power, and they are separate, and that the ideological authority of the Brahmin encompasses the practical power of the ruler. That is the power of force. And one could say that the only place that he recognizes for individual development is outside the system in people who take religious vows of one sort or another. How that would apply to the present Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, who goes dressed in robes and such. I would be interesting to know how a Dumontian would respond to that. In any case, the other thing one might add to Dumont's argument, and is implied within it, is that the system is broken down into segments, the process of segmentation, so that it repeats itself, as in some Hindu temples, where the temple as a whole is made up of little temples that compose the whole of the structure. That's an idea that was developed by the historian Burton Stein and his theories of South Indian kingship in the pre-colonial period. Now, what I would argue is that, first of all, Wilkerson gets things wrong. That she, for one thing, she thinks of the caste system as unchanging, as rigid, and so on. I'm looking at Ishita Banerjee Dubey, who knows much more about all of this than I do, but and I'm waiting to hear what you say. The caste system, if there is such a thing, is much more in flux, much more developing, and much changing before our eyes, changing within my lifetime dramatically, changing in the present dramatically. And the notion that it is some unchanging essential fact about India is wrong. I would say even beyond that, she gets it reversed, that it isn't that caste explains the condition of African Americans in the United States, is that the growing racism and racialization that is part of, I would say, modernity,
and the capitalist society, an argument that was developed long ago by Oliver Cox, that this racialization applies to India, and applies particularly at this moment to Muslims, who are being defined as a race apart. Now, what's the difference between caste and race? If you, these are just words, of course, and how they apply to the tremendous variation over time and space of South Asian societies. But theoretically, you could say that a caste system is defined by inclusion, subordination, but inclusion, that there is a division of labor. And one can go back to the Vedic model of Purusha dividing himself up into the Brahmin is the head and the Kshatriya is the shoulders, and so on and so on, as an understanding of the model of caste. Racism is a method of exclusion and ultimately of genocide or expulsion. That racism is something that has developed with modernity, because the only way to explain oppression, not based on individual achievement, but to whole categories of people, is to exclude them from humanity, essentially. And I think we're seeing that happening now with respect to Muslims in India in a very serious and frightening way. And that's an important reason that I took up this question of caste, something that I really paid almost no attention to when I was doing my research long ago about India Indian Muslims in northern India in the 19th century. Basically, caste did not come up. It didn't come up in my readings in any significant way. And yet now it's there. There's another thing that I should mention about caste and Muslims, and that is the increasing assertion that caste does indeed apply to Muslims, and assertion by Muslims. So there is a movement in India that started less than 25 years ago in Bihar called the Pasmanda Muslims. I don't know if that word exists in Pakistan at all, but it's a Persian word which means something like left behind. It means literally left behind, and it's something like leftovers from the meal, sobras, that people that has been adopted to apply to Muslims, and claims are made that this represents the overwhelming population of Muslims, that they are not, that there is this distinction between the high Muslims and the low Muslims, between the so-called Ashraf and the various other names, Ajlaf, and now we have, some people like to say there are Dalit Muslims, some people say Pasmanda Muslims, and other such terms. And that has become a movement in itself, undermining the claims of both among Muslims, many Muslims, the mainstream, if you want, of organized Muslim political and social movements, that Muslims are a unity, and undermining the notion often claimed from Muslims that Islam is inherently egalitarian. A very problematic statement, but nonetheless, as the world goes and as civilizations go, Islam. Sure. Okay. Does that work better? Okay. So let me start by reading something I wrote to just get us my guru, if you like, my ustad, was Bernard Cohn at the University of Chicago, and he was very influential in developing a kind of anthropology of the rulers. And specifically, he was concerned with the role of colonial knowledge, the colonial analysis by the British in the 19th century of Indian society, and how that in some ways motivated and transformed the way Indians thought of themselves and organized themselves. So the basic argument is that newly formulated identities emerged out of the expansion and elaboration of British colonial knowledge about Indian society and its implementation in law courts, in surveys of agricultural landholding, in recruitment of civil and military personnel, and recognition, ultimately, of political constituencies. That is, how the British defined Indian society in order to rule it was a major, and that whole process of defining is a major instigator of transformations of social identities in India. Colonial discourse established religion and caste, putting those words in inverted commas, as the key to understanding society, not, by the way, class, which we, that is what, and then you could, along with language, study the society and count up the number of people and put them in grids of identity through social surveys, through the census operations, according to gender, how many Muslim women, how many Muslim men, of what age, and so on, in localities, districts, states, and India as a whole, so that you could finally say, how many Brahmins are there in India? You could give a number. And in the case of Muslims, you could say, how many Sayyids are there in India? People who claim to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. All of this could be studied, and you could say how many of them speak Bengali, how many of them speak Tamil, how many of them speak Malayalam, and such. You could also say how many of them are blind, how many of them are insane. You know, all of those things are in the tables of that the British, and then they tried to set that off against categories of occupation. That's where the class thing comes in, and they basically felt that caste defines occupation. Something that, in fact, was empirically wrong, but that's what they said. Let me get to the next part. The British didn't agree. This was a huge enterprise in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volumes of texts, which now you can get on the internet if you're so inclined, of gathering all this data and describing these people. Largely, this took place in the starting in the late 19th century. The first full Indian census was in 1872, and actually that wasn't quite full, 1881. And the categories changed. It was every 10 years, and the categories changed from time to time, and there were controversies about them. In response, Indians, first of all, Indians participated in these, in creating these categories. They were telling the British what the indigenous terms were, but they also were mobilizing themselves. For example, to get people to declare that they were Hindus. There were a lot of categories of religion that could be counted as, people didn't call themselves Hindu. They called themselves the followers of, the largest level, Vaishnavites, maybe they would call it Shaktas or something like that. They had all kinds of names for their particular religion, and the idea that this was all encompassed within Hinduism was one thing. Now, for Muslims, it was also not clear. There's a wonderful line in one of the district gazetteers about the Gujars of, Gurgaon. And it says they can't really be called Hindus or Muslims. They observe the feasts of both religions and the fasts of neither. Sounds like a good idea. In any case, there were disputes about it. Count me as such and such. When somebody came to the door, the census taker came to the door, he had a list of instructions, and might ask, what language do you speak? And people didn't necessarily have the category Hindi. Very few people did. And there's a famous line in the linguistic survey that you asked somebody what language he speaks. He said, I speak Bhasha. I speak language. And what do those people 10 miles away speak? They speak Jungli. The language of the forest. And then you go to them and they speak Bhasha, and the other people speak Jungli. And people didn't have those categories. So there was, but before the 1901 census, people were going around telling people how to answer the questions and organizing them. At the same time, they were organizing themselves into voluntary associations with the labels of caste or religion or something like that, as a way of getting recognition, as a way of finding unities across large sweeps of the population within a region of India, or even perhaps in India as a whole. And that certainly included Muslims. In the course of the 19th century, the British were arguing whether the model that they had identified with Hinduism, drawing out of Sanskrit texts, ancient Sanskrit texts and so on, could be applied to Muslims. And what appealed to them was the notion of the 4 parts. So in the Vedic literature, there are the 4 varnas, the 4, one could say, orders of society. They looked to something they called the ashraf, from the word sharif. Shurafa are the people who are ashraf, or sharif, and it means something like exalted, literally. And in the Middle East, when you call somebody, it's used as a name, it implies descent of the Prophet, but in Iran, Afghanistan, and South Asia, a descendant of the Prophet is honored with the word Sayyid, or Mir sometimes. So that was one category, Sayyid. Then the next step down, because it had to be hierarchical, was Sheikh. Descendants of the companions of the Prophet, and there were subcategories of those, Faruqi, Siddiqui, and so on. And all of this, by the way, is to be used in the census. So they're counting them up, the numbers of people. Next level down, the Moguls. The Moguls, they are people of Central Asian origin, Chagatai and Mongol descent, however it might be defined, they were a category that could be counted. And then the Pathans, and the Pathans were people from Afghanistan. Supposedly their language was Pashto and so on, and they had come over the centuries, including some quite recently, but way back into the 13th and 14th centuries from Afghanistan and had been identified. There were major dynasties connected with them, but it was a large population with all of these with wide ranges of class, identity, occupations, and so on. These 4 categories were to be considered the ashraf. Now, where does this come from? There were in the past in the Islamic world, in the Islamic tradition, other categories of hierarchy that existed, but not this one. This 4-part ashraf thing is a 19th century invention. It first comes up in a Persian text written perhaps in 1815 in Lucknow by a man who himself was a convert to Islam from Hinduism, but was accepted as a Mogul. He was called a Mirza, which is a Mogul. And he said that none of these categories really apply because none of these people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and people are selling perfume in the streets and so on. How can you call them a Sayyid if they're selling perfume? And so that's his text. That's the earliest evidence of this 4-part ashraf business. And everybody else who constitute the overwhelming majority of Muslims are something else. They are other categories, often with caste names like Julaha, which meant weaver, or something of that. And again, those were counted up. Musicians might be a category. But they basically, the surveys and the censuses and so on identified these groups as somehow parallel to Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, and then the others, the categories. Whether that was right or wrong, one could say it has become a social reality, so that it has entered into the discourse in the present. So part of this colonial knowledge argument is that it was institutionalized. And you could say the same thing about languages. The continuum of languages gets bounded, taught in schools, standardized. The continuum of religious expression, the variation gets bounded and categorized and counted. So that you could say that in all of India, there were 1,000,000 to 200,000 Sayyids. Actually, they would, I can't come up with a number right now, but it goes down to the most precise number that in the census. And that becomes a category that can be developed. Now, actually, it didn't. The Sayyid part didn't develop into a category in the way caste developed into a category. The All India Caste Association, the All India, later on, Gujar Association, which included Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. All of these organizations were attempting to get recognition. And the British used this, by the way, most dramatically in the recruitment to the military. So that there are these handbooks, which again you can find now on the internet, which tell you the characteristics of a particular populations and who you want to recruit into the army, and often the name of the regiment, the Marathas, the Mahars, for example. These were all recruited, and the military handbook would say, for example, that the Sayyids are good fighters, but they don't respond well to orders. That kind of thing. And you get these kind of terrible, almost shameful stereotypes of people. Bernard Cohen used to make them into funny jokes, but in fact they're quite horrible. And I mean, they are so blatantly, nakedly prejudicial and so on. But that is the literature of the social surveys. So all of this is developing, by the way, alongside racism, because who are bringing racism? The British. Where are the big racial divisions? It's the British, the whites, the white man's burden and all of that. That was the context of British society. And you might say in the early 19th century, the biological concept of race wasn't there, that it was more cultural, and the famous Macaulay line that I want to create a class of Indians who are, though Indian in blood, color, will be British in tastes, manners, and opinions. Probably the most quoted line in all of Indian historiography. But it becomes racialized. It becomes the so-called pseudoscientific racism, and it goes along with the highly institutionalized system of segregation on the railways and clubs and organization and so on. So racism was finally the route to authority and power, not caste in the colonial society. How does that carry over into the present? That is the question that I think we want to consider and discuss. What is it about racism that overwhelms the variety of social relationships? The word caste, first of all, as you know, is not an Indian word. It is, in fact, originally a Portuguese word, casta, and I guess is it Spanish, casta? Yes, and when the Portuguese came, they applied it, but they had also applied it to themselves. Society was a society of different orders of people, depending on their descent and their manners and cultivation and so on. And it wasn't all that easy to move from one level to the other in anywhere. No more in India than in Europe. But that's what was identified and picked out as a way of understanding Indian society. It's really with the colonial period that Indians get defined into these fixed, unchanging categories, so that there is no possibility of organizing oneself for power and in the colonial society, or limited opportunities to do it, I should say. Now, I want to say a little bit about how Muslims dealt with it and with this colonial knowledge. And my interest initially was what was called the Oligarch Movement in the late 19th century, led by a man named Syed Ahmed Khan, who was a Syed. He was very proud of being a Syed. On his grave is his genealogy of Syeds, which is, by the way, completely paternal genealogy. In fact, his mother was not a Syed. His mother was a Kashmiri. He barely knew his father's family. But nonetheless, by virtue of being a Syed, he felt he had a particular closeness to the Prophet Muhammad and particular access. He didn't particularly think it about other people who were Syeds. And in fact, one of his great critics, who always refers to him as simply Syed, was himself a Sayyid, Sayyid Akbar al-Abadi, who wrote these very funny satirical poems about him. But it was part of his qualifications for leadership of a united Muslim society. And for him, it's very clear being Sharif was not a matter of descent. Descent was a good thing. If you were from a good family, you were more likely to have good manners, good access to education, and so on. When people were planning a marriage, that would be something you'd want to know, that they were from a good family, quote. All of those things are there. But in fact, his sons didn't marry Sayyids. His grandsons didn't marry Sayyids. They often married relatives that they knew, but Oligarch, in the college that he established in 1875, the kind of student cliques, the factions, cut across all those lines, including, by the way, the line of Sunni and Shia. And the overwhelming notion was that there was a unified Muslim identity. And the word he used for that was a word that, as far as I can tell, had not been used for Muslims as such before Sayyid Ahmad Khan started using it in the late 1860s. The word was Qaum. Spell it Q-A-U-M, if you like. Qaum came to mean, in current Indian parlance, community, in the sense of national community. And Qaumiyat came to mean communalism in its particular Indian meaning of religious divisions, as between Hindu and Muslim. This is all something that develops in the course of the late 19th century and then increasingly becomes an important part of politics. And for Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who had many close Hindu friends, by the way, it was essential for Muslims to unite because he was now aware, now that there had been a census and the possibility of elections coming up, that people better get themselves organized. Many people, especially in Pakistan, but also people hostile to Muslims in India, attribute to Sayyid Ahmad Khan the partition of India. I think that's ridiculous, that it would have happened without him and without Oligarch on its own. But the idea of organizing Muslims into a community across the wide sweep of Indian society was something that we begin to see with Sayyid Ahmad Khan, with others, Amir Ali and others in the late 19th century, culminating, for example, in the organization of the Muslim League in 1906, demanding separate electorates and representation for Muslims in any future legislative order. And that sets the ball rolling toward the kind of political separatism that we finally see in 1947. Many other things involved in that most complicated event. In the meantime, what about all those people who were not Ashraf or Sharif? Well, part of it was they wanted to be Ashraf and Sharif. So, for example, the so-called Jalahas, the weavers of Benares, they're not Jalahas anymore. They're Ansaris. And they're sheikhs. They are, if not in biological fact, they are in conceptually the inheritors of the companions of the Prophet. And they do their best to have poetry recitals with good Urdu, standardized Urdu recitations and all of that. That's part of becoming one model of being a Muslim. There are many others, of course. So there are many ways of being Muslims, and we could go on and on of the divisions of Muslim society. And the idea of caste as an element in it is there, and increasingly there among certain people, but is not much more important is the identification of Muslims as the other to Indian national identity. This is the model of the current ruling power of India, the Hindutva movement, if you like, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and Narendra Modi. And just this past year, there was a large gathering of people in that political movement in the city of Hardwar, and a number of speakers said quite simply, go out and kill a Muslim. Kill all the Muslims. We're talking about almost 200 million people in India. And not a word from Narendra Modi or any of his associates to disassociate themselves from it. On the contrary, laws have increasingly taken Muslims out of the mainstream and requiring them, if they are to stay, to be subordinate and to conform in dress, in food they eat, and so on, to this overriding new Hinduism, one could say, that is identified with the Indian nation. And it has become a frightening response. So how does one respond as a Muslim? One can respond by joining up. And there are people who do, who say, yes, yes, I'm just as there were Muslims who joined up with the British, there are people who join up with the Muslims who would join up with the Hindutva movement. So you can point to them and say that, yes, we're Muslims, but that's our private matter, and socially and culturally, we're part of the Indian nation, and nation before religion. Religion is just a private matter. And the other response is to unite as Muslims. That's what happened in partition, as what I would say is, on the whole, a defensive movement. Where that will lead in the present is very unclear, but these are very frightening times, and they have never been worse, as far as I can tell. I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a discussion, and I'll put on my mask.
Well, thank you, David, for a fascinating lecture, because you complimented the other side. I looked at, the census, what it did to, and there are many questions. I agree completely with, how frightening it is, the situation, but, I mean, it's gone, beyond anybody's control, let's say, yeah. Anyway, so I'll go back to the earlier period. One, this is just a comment. Your point about caste being about inclusion and race being about exclusion is well taken. But where do the Dalits figure then? Because their argument is precisely that it's dependence with exclusion, that they're holding up the structure of the system, but they're excluded. That's one. This is just a comment. The other questions, I need to look up your article more carefully for the references, but I wanted to know which census, from where, from when are they trying to find out these Varna, among the Ashrafs, and whose initiative? Because we know about Risley and the caste and race, you're absolutely right. People have argued that second half of the 19th century is absolutely the high point of race theory, and he wanted to be, in league with his other people, and it was not caste race, which is why he falls back on the Varna model, whereas all the reports being sent by the people who are doing the surveys, it's a bewildering kind of material, right? And his anthropometry, I agree completely with that. But when it is happening, who is kind of taking the initiative, and how does it come, how does it get objectified and categorized? And finally, I think Hunter's Indian Muslims has a lot to do with the Muslims being marked out as backward and their need to unite and need to come forward. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Well, there's much to be said about that, and in the article you'll see the references. So in the early 19th century, they really aren't talking about these categories. So that in the glossary of the castes and tribes of northwestern provinces, it doesn't, published initially in the 1840s, it's not there. So it does come later. And probably in the 1860s, we begin to see it with the peoples of India and things of that sort. And then it gets into a serious intellectual debate. People like Nesfield and who wrote about the caste system, and up to Rizvi, who you mentioned. Rizvi finally who becomes, out of all his census work and so on, he writes a book called The Peoples of India, and it turns out that if you are European, you cannot say, and you cannot say, did you know that? Try. And he goes through all of these things that the sounds of language are racially distributed, which is nonsense, of course. So that whole development of scientific racism, which is not just in India, it's happening in Europe and in the United States. There's a book that was written 2 or 3 years ago about the invention of the Caucasians by Nell Painter, which talks about how is it that the category white becomes known as Caucasian, and it's so stupid, the idea, that you want to laugh at it, and yet, of course, it's so horrible, the consequences of it. Now, the question of Dalits. First of all, there is an issue of does the category Dalit apply to Muslims? And this is a political issue now because there are reserved places for various categories of not only Dalit, the term now that is properly used for what used to be called untouchables, and before untouchables, many other things, because it wasn't a single unified category. You could say that they weren't actually excluded. They were necessary to the village. They were the ones who beat the drums. They were the ones who removed the cattle. They were the ones, and they were different levels of so-called untouchability, of pollutedness, but they were necessary to the society. In the older model, insofar as we can tell, they're never totally eliminated. There's soldiers and so on. So I still think that they are included in the ideology of caste, whatever it may be, and it's only. When do we start having violence against Dalits? Only when Dalits start asserting themselves politically, such as in Tamil Nadu, where there were violent burning down of villages and so on by higher castes and such.
So I don't know. This is something that you know more about than I do, and I think is worth thinking about. There is the question of to what extent people in those oppressed categories were then drawn to Islam. And if they were, it was clearly a gradual process over time. Generally, they were drawn to Sufi shrines or something like that. And then over time, they may have become Muslims. There's also the whole complex question of intermarriage and who, in fact, the mothers of all these people are, which is rarely included. Eventually, it becomes something to be discussed when families are arranging marriages. Well, his mother was a dancing girl or something like that. How could you have such people in a position of power? But in fact, they do get into positions of power, so I don't know. What was the third thing that you raised?
No, I just wanted to mention that, Hunter's Indian Muslim.
Oh, Hunter, yes. So Hunter wrote a book in, I think, 1871 called The Indian Muslims sometimes the title is wrongly quoted as Our Indian Muslims. Are they bound in conscience to rebel against the Queen? And he argues that any good Muslim would not accept British ruling authority. He also has a whole racial argument that when Muslims came to Bengal, their skin got darker because of the climate. And it was an early version of that kind of racism. But then he immediately switches off and starts talking about Muslims up in what is now the border areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that becomes the rest of the book. And his conclusion in the book is the only way to safeguard the empire is to corrupt the Indian Muslims so that they're not so religious. Give them an English education, and ultimately their religious ideas will drop away. He doesn't quite say they'll become Christians, but at least they will become enlightened in his view. And so the promotion of English education is the answer. That becomes, it's a very strange, actually quite powerfully written book, but actually the logic of it doesn't hold together, but it becomes part of a whole government program of, we've got a Muslim problem. What are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to push English education. That's, we're going to try and encourage it, and the Oligarch College is part of that.
Actually, sort of the questions in part follow from Ishita's. To begin with, I'm surprised that the question of caste didn't come up in relation to your study of Islam and its elites. Hadn't your friend Imtiaz Ahmed planned and published his impressive edited endeavor, especially caste and social stratification among Indian Muslims, around that time when you were haunting the University of Chicago? Because Imtiaz himself had not only spent time in your alma mater, University of Chicago, but was arguing against at once Dumont and Mickey Marriott, specifically the identification of the idea of Hinduism with, the idea of India with Hinduism, or the idea of Hinduism with India. Now, the second point is that, the second issue is that your arguments about caste, language, and divisions and unities of social categories as being worlded, being made of the world, along with their implication, along with their connections with articulation of race, are interesting. But the energies to challenge these static frames didn't actually disappear. The energies to challenge these kinds of static frames didn't actually disappear. They existed outside historiographical schemes as usual. And these historiographical schemes remain at large. So there is more to the Julahas and other Dalit Muslims than Islamic versions of Sanskritization, that they all wanted to become Ashraf. Because the question is also, how did they want to become Ashraf? And this is shown actually in the works such as those of Deepak Mehta and writings which have recently been surveyed by Joel Lee. But it's not just a question of who has written about it. It's a question of how are we to read these marginal so-called marginal energies, and what do they offer in terms of the sort of schemes and frames which we bring to understanding in broad strokes. This gets me to the third point, which is, Dumont Dumont is a curious creature. He's certainly not the last Orientalist. Orientalists abound in India today and have done so among protagonists and players of different stripes, different political stripes. You mentioned some of them, but they exist along, on the other side as well. So the question actually concerns, the important question here is that of inclusion, okay? Let's not forget that it's actually Dumont who points to inclusion in a very strong way, okay? Ultimately, it is the caste order is defined by inclusion, which is what binds together the Brahmin and the untouchable. But it's not just Dumont, but his critics such as Dirks, Raheja, Nicholas Dirks, Gloria Raheja, Declan Quigley, Arjuna Padurai, and Carol Breckenridge, as well as Mickey Marriott in a very different way, who speak actually in terms of exclusion, right? And that's where the entire question of the Dalit perspective comes in, or not just that Dalit in terms of institutionalized politics, but beyond that. So what's happening? From the perspective of Dalits, and I'm not just speaking about the Ambedkarite stuff, after the interwar years, from much before, what is happening is, from the perspective of the people we know as Dalits, there's actually a conjunction of different forms of meaning and power within the caste order. One is the ritual hierarchy of purity and pollution, Dumont. The other is the cultural configurations of caste and of cultural configurations of kingship and dominant caste, as in the works of Raheja, Quigley, Dirks, as also in the schemes of redistribution among, as are argued by Arjun, for example, and Carol Breckenridge, right? Now, what's happening over here is that there's a coming together of, as forms of power, of these schemes of meaning and power of the Brahman, of culturally defined kingship, and of forms of and symbols of colonial power which become a part of the caste order. We like to think, whether historians or anthropologists, that caste was something which was irremediably Desi. It was totally Indian, right? But caste was actually, in practice, structured by the everyday symbols and lives of colonial power. And far from the Ambedkarite emphasis, what is happening, this is shown by the oral testimonies, for example, of subaltern groups such as Satnamis during the interwar years in very powerful ways. This comes out of their oral testimonies. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is the fact that we need to look at the question of inclusion, okay, in terms of its hierarchies, in terms of its being grounded. Yes, people are being included, but what are the forms of occlusion? What are the forms of domination which work through inclusion as also through exclusion? And this gets me to what Ishita was arguing. What is happening with the Ambedkarite or Dalit presence, in terms of institutionalized politics, is that they are stressing exclusion. They are not, going into the question of inclusion at all. Okay, and this is itself a conundrum. I'm not going to say you're wrong, because this is the way in which they have to mobilize. right? So I think there's loads to think about rather than resolve, which gets me to the last point, and I'll be quick. You know, Isabel Wilkerson, I think, you know, she gets it. You know, she gets it terribly wrong. I mean, you're right about that. But I'd like to know why she gets it wrong, right? Why this emphasis on absolute exclusion? Why this fact? Because, I mean, forms of inclusion have existed in relation to slavery as well. In the American South, for example, forms of paternalism, which actually, you know, which were forms of hierarchical inclusion, which existed together with, you know, with the whipping and so on. I mean, it's just together that made possible, you know, plantation slavery as well as plantation capitalism as a kind of a model for the United States. But there's a kind of a play of inclusion-exclusion which is going on there as well in its own ways. So why is Isabel Wilkerson making the kind of argument and its success? I think it actually has to do with how we look at power at large as a dystopian totality, which always excludes. The second part of it is scholarship and, you know, on blacks in the United States, which is determined in part by what Michelle Wright has called the Middle Passage epistemology. Everything is determined by slavery. And this shows up, for example, in the 1492 project, right? So what's happening is that there's this Middle Passage epistemology, and what you have is an emphasis on what's been called Afro-pessimism, right? Afro-pessimism, which is an aesthetic. You know, it's a powerful aesthetic. It's about you know, it's about African Americans today constituting the abject body, right? But, I mean, you know, again, it's a very powerful argument, but what it misses out are the other forms of occlusion and inclusion, such as those of settler colonialism. What happens to, you know, to other kinds of black bodies of the migrant and figures of precarity, those out of Africa, you know, but in Europe right now, one, and what happens to the indigenous. So, I mean, it's a whole bunch of questions, but I think, you know, we need to take these together. And, you know, you started it all with a provocative comment.
Well, you've said an awful lot, and it's hard for me to know where to respond, but let's talk about inclusion in what and exclusion from what. What are the units that we are trying to imagine? And one thing that is clearly the nation state and citizenship. That's a locus of inclusion or exclusion. That's a place where it happens. Yeah, no, I'm just. That's one place where it happens. It happens in, let's say, temples. You know, that's clearly a place where it happens. Exclusion, but how important is that, and to whom is it important? So, for example, in Tamil Nadu, Brahmins are excluded now entirely from the political scene, and they've disappeared. Many have gone to Silicon Valley. Many have gone to the IITs and such. This is what Chris Filler has written about, and other people have moved into positions of that were held by Brahmins in Tamil Nadu, which is very different from the position of Brahmins in Punjab, where they were not particularly significant. So many different stories to tell in India. The one thing that I would say, and now that we're speaking in the so-called world of globalized capitalism, where Silicon Valley is part of the story, there are many arenas
of exclusion and exclusion. And maybe there is no overall theory that one can hold it all together with. And if there is a theory, it has to do with the economic order and not with the cultural roots of that order, even if people explain it in that way and think of it through that way, they can only get so far with it. It doesn't really hold on from generation to generation. Yeah.
What we miss out in is that IIT graduates who go off to Silicon Valley and before that to MIT, or who attend IIT Madras. I mean, Ajanta Subramanian's fabulous ethnography shows, the forms of discrimination which exist, including leading to suicides among Dalit students in IIT. So, so let's bring together the so-called economic, which is never a separate domain anyway, with the cultural. And my point is, of course, there are various forms of exclusion and inclusion. I'm totally against one large singular model. But what I'm trying to say is the crucial question is of dominance, of meaning and power. It is not about, which is played out on different registers, which changes, which transforms. But, the entire question of dominance, of meaning and power does not disappear. Otherwise, what are we talking about here?
Okay, well, I think this is discussions we could have. I can answer it only by fragmenting your into little bits and pieces, because I can't really put together, and I don't think in some sense it's empirically possible to put together a whole large package of dominance and power in the world through individuals as opposed to institutions, and even groups as opposed to institutions. So who has power in society? And in Indian politics, that's immensely complicated. Who has power in India now is one of the good things that one could say about India is that people are having these arguments, and there still is a public discourse, and I hope it will continue, in which the question of dominance and power is understood. And we've seen tremendous resistance over the past 2 years in particular to the efforts to create a monolithic India, and to bow down to the forces of whether they be Hindutva or capitalism that would sweep away all of India's variation.
I'm not at this level at all, but one question would be, to what extent, of course, within Buddhism, which is of course a very minor religion in India, and it's associated with the Dalit, but goes beyond the Dalit as well. There is a discourse, there has been a discourse against caste, and to what extent do you find that discourse within Islam?
Within Islam? Yes, yes. Well, first of all, about Buddhism, one has to mention right at the last year of his life, Ambedkar adopted Buddhism as the response of liberating the oppressed of India. And now there are millions of people who identify with Ambedkar's Buddhism. They have made a great effort to make connections. One could also say that in Sri Lanka and Burma, Buddhism has become an instrument of racialization in the same way that I've said Hindutva has made Hinduism a. Now, as for Islam, there is a long-standing debate going back into the early centuries of Islam. There's a very good book by a scholar named Louise, I think it is, Marlowe, on hierarchy and egalitarianism in Islam, which only deals with the first centuries of the Abbasid Caliph up to, I guess, the 14th century. And we have extensive discussions about egalitarianism. And there is, and that continues in Oligarch, for example, which I was talking about, and it continues very much into the present. It is, and you could say it is parallel to not only to Buddhism, but to Christianity. Christianity claims a kind of egalitarianism too, but we have a whole history of aristocracies and oppression of lower groups, and it's all settled in the afterlife. When it's all said and done, as in, you could say, if you believe in reincarnation, it's all settled. If you were oppressed and you were a good man or woman, later on, you'll get your turn, and that's some way of people dealing with it. You know, in Christianity, it is said that it's easier. What is it? The line? It's easier for a camel to move through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. And people respond, well, see how wonderful God's grace is? A camel can get right through an eye of a needle. Well, that's a Dumontian division of power and authority. So these debates take place in these different societies. People understand them. My understanding of Buddhism in Japan, where there was an aristocracy, is that it's the afterlife, that it's reincarnation, it's something else that makes it possible, or it's leaving society in some way by like Bashu, going off into wandering.
Talk about Japan. I'm talking, I guess,
in India.
Specifically, the discourse of Ambedkar or other Buddhist intellectuals like Ambedkar who were actively against caste.
Yes. So Ambedkar's program is, as the title of one of his major works is, The Abolition of Caste. Now, one could say that the program that he created as the father of India's constitution, or a major formulator of Indian constitution, was to entrench these identities into a system of affirmative action, which has made a competition for low status. Now we get, everybody wants to be, if they're not a Dalit, at least a other backward caste. OBC is the term. And then there's the distinction between the other backward caste, and if you are among the privileged, then you are the creamy layer of the other backward class. Narendra Modi is from another backward caste, but he is able to present himself by his actions as somebody who is pure and sacred and does all. He appropriates all the symbols that are available to him as a high caste Hindu. So there are these different strategies. The creation of Buddhism, in Ambedkar's understanding of Buddhism, was that it was egalitarian. He was tempted to go, by Islam. That was one of the things he thought. Basically, he wanted to get out of what he defined India as a caste society by identifying it with Brahmanical authority, with the Sanskrit texts, which are entrenched in ritual and much more in law. The law of access to temples, the law of access to property, and so on, which are, and that's what he wanted to get out of. And he thought that Buddhism, it's after all an Indian religion, it has its roots in India, and that would be the answer. I don't really think it has worked to the benefit of.
But there's no Islamic Ambedkar. I guess that's my question.
Oh, well, first of all, the Pasmanda's now movement has ever since the late 1990s, has very deliberately taken that language of Ambedkar and applied it to Muslims. Yes, that's happened. But the other answer is to say all Muslims are equal. And you can point to lots of Muslims who are not of high genealogy, who have been recognized. Now, the leader of Deoband, for example, declared himself a Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet. What was the evidence for that? He had a dream that he was a Sayyid. So that was one strategy. But more generally in Deoband, which is one of the great madrasas of the Islamic world and part of the movement, is a sense of all Muslims are equal. Now that may lead to the Taliban, they're associated with Deoband as well, but all Muslims are equal. It is an egalitarian system, so it's there as one part, and even those people who claim in their genealogy some credit and so on will, if you start pressing them on it, will say, yes, finally all Muslims are equal, and won't push it to the kind of distinctions. It comes up in more private matters like marriage arrangements or something like that.
Okay, I have a much simpler question coming to this side of the room. So you mentioned that caste, you said it's just a word and then there is only in English. So a lot of questions come to my mind about when this word was being used, started to be used in the Indian national context. How was this word translated into other contexts and into other languages in India? Right now or in the past? Because I guess my question is, in order to talk about the caste system in the national context in India, can it only happen in English or can it also happen in other languages? And if it's happening in other languages, are people talking about the same thing? Is it being translated into a local language or is it being understood however people want it to be understood? That's my question.
Good. It's a very good question. I compiled a list of words that were used for caste, and they are various in lineage, like brotherly is one. Sometimes people use that, which means a kind of patrilineal descent group. That sometimes is used for caste. There are many different kinds of categories that get translated as caste. And for example, in Urdu and in Pakistan, when people want to talk about caste, they say zatpat, which means any kind of division based on some notion of birth-derived identity. what the American sociologists used to call ascriptive identity or something of that sort. It's just, it's a catch-all term which has dozens of possible translations. So one word is the very Sanskritic word of Varna, the major 4 orders of the Vedic texts. Those are not actualized as in real life as consolidations of people, as solidarities of people. Those are ways of thinking about society, kind of in the way that we think of middle class, or upper class, or working class, or whatever the terminology. Actually, in the United States, we don't have a working class. Everybody is middle, and we don't have an upper class. We just have a middle class. And some of them are very rich, and some of them are very poor.
Varna actually is an operative category, the 4 or 5-fold Varna division, where it is an operative category, is at the level of the ranking of jatis, because you refer to Zatpat, but the crucial category in terms of caste is actually jati. I mean, that is where these are not just hierarchically graded, but these are, jatis are the forms where the units, basically, if you will, which depend on endogamy, commensality, occupation, and the hierarchical grading. So Varna actually provides, the 4 or 5-fold division, provides the scheme for the grading of these jatis, which are not just 5, but which are actually thousands. Lower at the top, many, many more at the bottom. So, there's a spread. Now, the crucial thing here is that rather than, we must think of this in terms both of the colonial and the pre-colonial, and not just the national context, because the way in which caste, in terms of, came to be identified with Varna under the early Orientalists was profoundly challenged with what you were speaking about, the census operations, when people realized, when the census officers and their subordinates realized, the subordinates knew, Indian subordinates knew this anyway, that there are literally hundreds and thousands of jatis. So, there are, it's not just a question of the mapping of the English word caste, but it's actually a question of the entanglements and confusions between caste or kasta on the one hand and jati and varna on the other.
Well, I would respectfully disagree that, first of all, jati just is a very vague term, which means any identification based on birth. The word is used for male versus female, for example. It's used for different musical modes. It was used in the dictionaries of the All India Radio for nation. And there are so many gradations of any birth-defined category, you might say, or any in some sense. And there is huge debate of where the group I identify with fits into a Varna scheme. So what is a Patidar? What is a Patel? What is a Maratha? What is a Nadar? These are all consolidations of caste identities that have developed with great organizational self-consciousness and have transformed themselves over time, but they are not entirely successful. So Shivaji got himself declared a Kshatriya. He had to bring down some Brahmins from Benares to do it because no Maratha Brahmin would have done it, to declare him a Kshatriya. But the run of Marathas Some will tell you that they are Shudras, and some will tell you that they are, in my experience, that they are Kshatriyas. Patels, same story. Or they make a big effort to suddenly become vegetarians, as an argument that's what we really were once upon a time. We have many Dalit groups who declare that they are of Brahmin descent and or Rajput descent, and they argue about it. And this becomes so. It's part of the vocabulary of discourse, but it is not part of the social reality.
It is absolutely a part of social reality. You know, I mean, I'm sorry. Having worked on the Satnamis, having worked on the Dalits, you know, Jati is an absolutely integral part. It's not just an epistemological question. It's not just a question of something which is, yes, it varies, and this is precisely about the interplay of Varna and Jati. But, you know, Jati is a means of identification. Yes, you know, in Bankim's category, you know, when you know, this character of Bankim is asked in a law court, so what is your Jati? He precisely answers. He laughs. He's a madman. He says, what do you mean by Jati? Sri Jati, woman Jati, or Purush Jati? Okay? But that doesn't mean, that's Bankim's way of actually querying the fact that there is. You can play the conceptual games, but actually Jati exists. It's a form of identification. And what you're speaking about, the identification of, for example, Patel's arguing this, it's an interplay of Jati and. Jati is, you know, it's about people who you marry. It's about, you know, it's about who you eat with. It's about wearing, you know, riding a palanquin, going in a palanquin as a Dalit, or, you know, on a horse, or wearing a pagadi and being killed for that. It's about Jati, you know, what explains the lower caste being, the lower caste woman being, girl being raped is actually Jati. Okay, and it is alive, it's concrete. And, you know, it's neither national nor colonial. It is, we have to go beyond forms of institutionalized politics.
And you're arguing that it has not changed over time?
Of course it's changed over time. The fact, of course, it's changed, you know, it's changed enormously over time, but to argue that, you know, something exists doesn't mean that it doesn't change over time. It's, you know, I mean...
Well, I think one of the transformations is the large-scale consolidation of people, so that now if we talk about Marathas or Patels, we're talking about millions of people who did not interact with each other in the past, who lived in micro societies on the whole, and where these things work their way out in a variety of different ways. And yes, who gets to ride on the elephant or the horse or something at a wedding is important, but I think that that has changed over time too, and very much in the urban setting, and very much in
David, I'm sorry, but I think where we disagree or talking at cross purposes is the following. There is the bird's eye view, where you want to look at forms of consolidation on a large scale, or there is that where you want to understand the forms of consolidation in terms of everyday lives. So the Patels, for example, you know, the very form of the upper Patidars and the lower Patidars, the very forms of struggle over there, the very forms of the Patidars were hypergamous groups. You know, all these worked in terms of kinship, and you know, and hypergamy and marriage, and women were crucial there.
I mean,
So what I'm getting at is the fact that you can look at it from the ramparts, you know, of academe, and look at it in terms of a bird's eye view, or one can try to understand it in terms, these questions in terms of the nitty-gritty of everyday life. And I think that's where we are perhaps, you know, talking past each other.
Well, the issue of kinship is, which we should discuss, because in some sense that's perhaps the most important part of these things that we call caste or jati take place. And the question is, like, who gets to marry who, or who gets to eat food prepared by who. That is so various in India, and so many different rules. And within in a so-called jati, with all the systems of gotras and rules and this and that, it's very hard to put that all together into a single phenomenon that we call the caste.
I'm just trying to say that there's a concreteness, to categories, that they're not just various. We can't just go back to the question of the multiple, the empirical multiplicity, and therefore say that categories don't exist. Ultimately, it's about a question of whether we want to use. It's not just about that. Yes, there is enormous, multiplicity and heterogeneity in terms of kinship, in terms of marriages, etc. But forms of violence, against, in this time of immediation, okay, with Facebook, with Twitter, the forms of violence against, lower caste women have increased, okay? This is not a happy story of progress, okay? I mean, and this is about jati. This is about wounded jati. I'm sorry, I'm at, sort of agitated about this, but, it's about the ground.
It happens, and it's important, but it's not universal.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I've gotten orders that the time for the event is over, and we can continue this discussion afterwards. But for anyone who needs to leave, they can leave. And thank you for coming. Thank you, David. No? And thank you, Satomi. She worked really hard to organize everything. A big thank you. And to the media team.